For 1,000 years, alchemists tried to turn lead into gold, and they failed. That's the story most of us know. But what we don't learn is that in the process of chasing that impossible goal, they invented chemistry. They discovered phosphorus, developed distillation, created the first labs, and documented hundreds of processes that became the foundation of modern medicine and manufacturing. The goal may have been wrong, but the work was real. But here's something else they discovered, something they call the philosopher's stone. And it wasn't about gold at all. The study of alchemy is older than the actual term alchemy. The Greeks had it, so did the Arabs, the Chinese, and the Indians. Each tradition had its own version of the same core goal, turning base materials into something better. In Europe, alchemy was at its peak from the 12th to 17th century. Roger Bacon, Robert Boyle, Isaac Newton, all three practiced alchemy alongside their more famous scientific work. Newton reportedly spent more time on alchemy than on physics. His alchemical manuscripts, stored at Cambridge, fill thousands of pages. The modern story treats alchemy as a failed proto-science, superstitious people fumbling toward chemistry. That story is too simple. The truth is, the medieval alchemists understood something that modern industrial chemistry mostly ignores, that the work you're doing with materials is connected to the person doing the work, that transformation in the lab and transformation in the self go together. Now that might sound mystical, but it had a very practical side. What the alchemists were actually best at was preservation and preparation. Their texts, many of which have been translated and are available in academic archives, contain step-by-step instructions for fermenting and distilling medicinal plants, for preserving food through salt, smoke, fat, and acid in ways that kept it safe for months or years, for making plant extracts and herbal preparations that we now recognize as early medicine, and for working with metals for tools and construction. The Arab alchemists, particularly Jabir Ibn Hayyan in the 8th century, known in the West as Jabir, developed systematic ways of purifying substances, controlling temperature, and making repeatable chemical processes. Jabir's descriptions of distillation, crystallization, and calcination, which is the process of heating a substance to a high heat, these were essentially correct. His texts were translated into Latin in the 12th century and formed the backbone of European chemistry for the next 500 years. None of that is disputed. It's the standard history of science. What gets dismissed, though, is the parallel tradition, the practical knowledge of land, food, plants, and preparation that the alchemists documented alongside their lab work. That knowledge was passed down through apprenticeship. When the apprenticeship system broke down, when industrial food production replaced home preparation, the practical knowledge went with it. The early modern period, roughly 1600 to 1800 AD, is when alchemy got replaced by chemistry. That transition was real and necessary. The experimental method, careful measurement, and the rejection of mystical causation were genuine advances, but the transition was not clean. When institutions decided that alchemy was discredited, they didn't carefully separate the valid practical knowledge from the failed theory. They threw out the baby with the bathwater. The recipes in alchemical texts for preservation, fermentation, herbal preparation, metalworking, etc. didn't make it into the chemistry curriculum. They survived in folk traditions, in the kitchens of rural households, in the practices of people who never read a chemistry textbook. Then industrial food production made those practices feel unnecessary. And now, 2 or 3 generations into a world where most people don't know how to preserve a harvest or identify a medicinal plant, that knowledge, which was transmitted for thousands of years, is genuinely at risk of being lost. The revival of interest in fermentation, preservation, and traditional food preparation isn't a trend, it's a response to a real gap. During supply chain disruptions in 2020, millions of Americans discovered they didn't know how to feed themselves without a grocery store. That experience prompted a serious look at traditional skills. The science backing up traditional preservation methods has gotten stronger, not weaker. Fermented foods like kimchi, sauerkraut, and kefir have been the subject of hundreds of peer-reviewed studies in the last decade. Researchers have documented their effects on the bacteria in your gut, on immune function, and on inflammation. The mechanism behind what traditional cultures passed down through practice is now understood at the molecular level. Cold process soap making, fat rendering, herb drying, root cellaring, all of these are documented effective techniques that require no electricity, no factory, and no supply chain. The alchemists weren't doing chemistry badly, they were doing something older, passing down survival knowledge through a framework that their culture could understand. Here's what strikes me. The alchemists may have been wrong about the philosopher's stone. They never turned lead into gold, at least not that we know of, but they preserved and passed down a body of practical knowledge for over 1,000 years. Food preparation, plant knowledge, fermentation, how to eat when there's no grocery store. And we lost most of it in about 70 years. We traded it for a supply chain. So it begs the question, what happens when the supply chain breaks? That question has been driving a lot of interest in what you might call lost ways. Practical skills for self-reliance that our great-grandparents knew, but most of us don't. There's a free resource I want to point you to. It's a collection of traditional preparation techniques, food preservation, self-reliance skills, the kind of practical knowledge that survived for centuries before the grocery store made it feel unnecessary. If you want to check it out, the link is in the description. Even if you don't use it now, it's a wonderful thing to have on hand just in case. The alchemists may have failed at transmutation, but they succeeded at something harder and something perhaps more important, and that is keeping a practical knowledge alive across dark centuries through wars and plagues and institutional collapse. They just wrapped it in symbols so that it would survive. We stripped the symbols away and threw out what was inside. If you'd like to learn more shocking science that's been buried by the modern scientific establishment, hit the subscribe button and I'll see you in the next one.